Okay, another method which is available in the gadget container interface uh, is get components, right? So components are gadgets. I could have named it this get gadgets, but decided to. So these are graphical user interface components, which could be any kind of gadget which is available in the system. So what it returns back, of course, it returns back an array list of all gadgets. So anyone who wants can get access to the list of gadgets, and naturally, this is what we're trying to do to to store our gadgets, perhaps use an array list. But in addition to this, remember when you have a method which returns an array list, of course it will never copy the array list. Array list is an object, and in Java, when you pass objects as parameters or return object references from your methods, such as get components, of course, it's only going to pass back a reference to the original array list. So the interface doesn't care where that array list is. It's your responsibility eventually to write code for get component, find the right location of that array list, and return its reference back to the caller. Handle event, a method to sync event notifications from gadgets. Something to be explained in a few more iterations through this. Okay, so the next interface that we have to deal with is iGadget, and of course, yes, you just go in and add this interface, right? So this is the approach to this homework. You need to have interfaces. Well, you have to create them, right? So it's a new, and so once again, this is the name of my package, right? Homework 3 demo, and I'm going to say new Java interface and copy and paste its name if you'd like, or type it in and finish. And so you create new interface, and yes, the entire homework design is that you simply copy and paste the methods proposed that you need to support by each gadget, right? So we have this set of these methods. I can copy and paste them here. And then, of course, I can say source format just to keep the default formatting. I don't know why it didn't. Oh, I see why. Source format. I don't know. Or whatever. So one of the requirements that is specified later in this handout is that every gadget that you create, every actual button, text box, or checkbox should have an ID. An ID is a string, and because we need to establish some sort of intercommunication between different components, different gadgets, we're going to be finding them by their ID. So that's why we say that in our code, each gadget implementing this specific interface named iGadget is supposed to provide an ID. There is also a click. So click is kind of natural. This emulates a mouse click on the gadget. So button can be clicked, text box can be clicked, checkbox can be clicked, and so forth. Set text. So for a text box, set text apparently will use a text to be stored inside the text box control. For a button, maybe set text will set the caption of the button, which is visible to the user. And get text naturally just returns it back. So not very difficult interface to deal with if you think about graphical user interface components. Well, sure enough, button could naturally respond to these methods and text box and all others as well. So moving on, let's see what else is here. And there it says, look, let's support the following graphical user interface controls in this emulation. A button, okay, just a generic button. Button X, which is like this X button in the at the title bar of the form. So basically, this makes user to if they somehow found a way to click on this button, it will close the entire window and perhaps will force exit out of application. And naturally, because button X is kind of button, it extends the button. Right? So the button class is a superclass, and so button X is a subclass of that superclass. Also, button submit, we will see what that does. Button clear is supposed to clear off, values of all text boxes on the window, and button submit, in our case, will simply print values entered by the user in those text boxes. We also will support the gadget name text box. We also will support, for the sake of practice with inheritance, we will also support another class which is named the mandatory text box, and it extends the text box. So simply the idea behind the mandatory text box that it's not going to allow to submit or do anything valuable with the data entered by the user on this form unless all mandatory text boxes are populated. In other words, somehow we need to find a way to implement validation for every mandatory text box that before we can, for instance, submit data, which in our case in this demonstration simply is going to print data on screen. We're going to give an error and say, look, you really cannot do this because there are mandatory text boxes which needs to be populated by the user before you can submit, for example. Okay, so those types of things, and other text boxes can be empty, that's legal, but the mandatory text box has to be populated. Okay, moving forward. Each gadget should provide a constructor taking unique ID. Okay, now how do you deal with this, right? I would say, okay, button. So let me give you a few examples. Class name button, right? So because it's like at the top of the hierarchy of some of the other subclasses here, you just naturally go here and say create new class, right? So this is a routine type of thing. New Java class name button, and say finish and create that class. So don't be shy to just go ahead and create these classes, right? Now, jumping ahead of this particular description, of course, I can tell you that by design, we said that those gadgets make sense only if they implement iGadget interface, which I happen already added to that. And then, of course, if you do something like this, you can see that button instantly becomes unhappy because it needs to implement all methods declared in iGadget interface. So therefore, you can switch to iGadget interface and simply copy and paste these methods, right, into the button class naturally, because this is how you work with interfaces. You just say, okay, my responsibility as a programmer is to provide implementation for all of these methods, which I'm supposed to implement. So let me demonstrate here. So I would typically, since it can be overwhelming in terms of how many methods you need to implement, and yet you want to make your code compilable as soon as possible. What you do, you first of all, you replace the semicolons with those curly braces which create method bodies and provide you space to write implementation. This is what we call a stubbed out version of the interface implementation. Of course, it would be extremely helpful to add an override because we're trying to implement the interface. It's a given, but that in every commercial application you declare an override, and of course methods returning strings will have to return something. So I typically would do something like this: return unimplemented implemented right there, right, just to indicate that the method still hasn't been implemented. And get text does similar thing. I will implement it eventually, but right now just the version is unimplemented. Integer can return 0, right, and the comment should be unimplemented. So we still have to implement this, and set text doesn't return anything, so we really don't have to do anything. I told you that if you look at iGadget interface, inside the interface, every single method that you declare is by default public. Unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you want to think about this, in the implementation you have to say public, because otherwise class will assume that those methods are private. So therefore, we provide method signatures in this application, and this is how you make a button at the very beginning, at those early stages, implementing iGadget interface. So so that's just a demonstration. You're going to do similar work in other pieces of this application when you want to create classes that implement specific interfaces. But switching back to this description, it says that each gadget should provide constructor taking unique ID. Well, guess what? In my world, when I see something like this in my business description or whatever functional spec that I'm dealing with, and it says string unique ID, well, guess what? I just copy and paste it into my code, right? So I go back to my class and say, okay, they tell me I need to have a public, most likely public constructor named button, because button is a class, right? And so it takes string unique ID, right? And also logically thinking about it, it is that it's very likely that what should be happening in my class, that I need a private string, perhaps unique ID or ID. I'll name it unique ID to be consistent, if that was what was declared there. So private string unique ID, and of course in my constructor I can initialize it, right? I can say this unique ID equals unique ID that was given to me as a parameter, right? So so that's the constructor that I want to have, because that's what the description says. Okay, so very well that then. So then someone using the gadget is free to do the following, right? So I'll demonstrate, for instance, that I can now go to my main app, and right here I can say button, or actually iGadget, right? Because iGadget interface is already in place, and I can say gadget equals new button, because when you create new objects, you have to specify their type. And of course, the button requires some kind of unique ID, right? We can call this, I don't know, submit button, whatever. Okay, so this works. I can create a gadget like that, and I can even go and test it by saying something like system .out .print print line, and say gadget dot get ID, right? I know that ID is stored there, right? So that's the thing that should be available. Of course, switching back to the actual code for the button class, you can see that I already have unique ID, but at the same time get ID returns unimplemented, so very likely that this should be replaced already by simply saying unique ID, right? And then when we say set text, In case of a button, well, that's going to be something else. That's going to be a separate string, a button caption. So I'm not going to change anything else at this point. But you'll get the idea. It's just a normal work, but this time dealing with a class which by requirement has to implement an interface.